To have a opportunity for interaction, hopefully reasonably informal interaction between those of you from the project who are interested and the members of the technical committee who are present. Let's start by introducing ourselves. I'm Bdale Garbee.
And Keith Packard.
Ian Jackson.
Russ Alberry.
Colin Watson. Steve Langoshek.
Great.
It's just
So-
like an RC meeting.
No, we use Nixon.
Yeah, well. So what I'm going to, so in fact, we have present today 6 of the 8 current members of the technical committee. Andy Barth could not be here at Debconf this year, and Don was here over the weekend, I understand, though I didn't actually get to see him. I understand he's taken off for another event this week. It is Burning Man week after all. So for those of you who don't, is there anyone who is sort of completely clueless about what the Debian Technical Committee is? Okay. There's always a straight man somewhere in there. Thanks, Rocky. The Technical Committee is defined by the Debian Constitution, and it has a fairly limited but significant role in the project. There are 4 to 8 members at any given time appointed by a combination of the sitting Debian project leader and the current members of the committee. Section 6 of the Constitution covers sort of what the behaviors of the committee are expected to be. It's important to understand that the focus of the technical committee is supposed to be on technical policy, and in places where action might be taken are things like developers' jurisdictions overlapping and an inability to come to a resolution on which of multiple technical alternatives is the best one to go forward with. We tend to only act when we are explicitly asked to engage in a particular decision process. The committee does have the authority to overrule a developer, though as Steve was pointing out in another session yesterday evening, there's an interesting little loophole where it does not appear that we have the ability to overrule a delegate's decision, which means that some infrastructure-related technical decisions could be interesting for us to deal with. We have the right to offer advice in addition to making sort of,
But only the technical committee has that right. Sorry.
Yes. I think the point is it's possible for us to engage in a conversation with developers and provide, some sense of wisdom without necessarily having to make a decision that requires a vote, but this always gets a little weird. There are a couple of interesting sort of limiting features. One is that according to the Constitution, the committee is not really supposed to engage in the design of new proposals. Members of the committee, of course, are also developers and may very well be very involved in helping to design new solutions. And it's almost impossible for a group of technologists to discuss any open question without postulating, wouldn't it be nice if we had a 3rd alternative or a 4th alternative or a 5th alternative? So this is an interesting one that we can be challenged a little bit sometimes in our discussions to remember. And then finally, the technical committee is supposed to be a decision of last resort. In almost all cases, it's better for Debian if the decisions are made by the developers who are working on the particular piece of technology. And in fact, Steve was commenting this morning, it's interesting that we've had a few cases in the last year where issues have been brought to the committee or to some subset of the committee informally or otherwise, and we've been able to provide some advice, and things have been able to happen without actually having to bring a formal issue in front of the committee for specific action. That's all cool, it's great. The point is that we're trying to help and to help deal with situations where the normal processes of the project just aren't cutting it. One of the things that we instituted a couple of years ago was actually a suggestion from Zach, which has worked out really well. So we meet roughly monthly on IRC to discuss the currently open issues and goad each other on to do things about them. Don Armstrong has been running those meetings, manages an agenda that we maintain in our shared Git repository, and the minutes of all those meetings are available somewhere. I'm not sure where you look for them, but they are around. And of course, anyone who'd like is welcome to hang out with us on the the appropriate IRC channel at the right time and watch the discussion. Over the last year, been kind of an interesting year for the committee. There are 5 things that were sort of officially brought to the committee and got resolved since Debconf and Vomarku last year. That started with adding a new member to the technical committee. Keith was not a member of the TC in Vomarku last year and is now. That concluded a fairly long process, which I must apologize was made longer because of various things that were going on in my life, but we did eventually conclude, and we now have a full 8, which is the maximum number of members the committee is currently allowed to have under the Constitution. I'm sure you'll all be shocked to hear that we spent a little bit of time on init systems in the last year. There was then a follow-up issue that was brought based on behaviors coming out of that decision. We recently finally got around to voting on the question of what the default libjpeg implementation for Jessie should be. And I put on here as resolved, even though it hasn't actually had a closure email yet, this question of what the appropriateness is of alternate dependencies on non-free things in main. All 8 members of the committee have now cast votes. The result is no longer in doubt, but given everything that was happening in the run-up to Debconf here, the closure email on that hasn't actually happened yet, but that's, at this point, I think resolved and okay to put on that list. There are 4 issues sort of officially before the committee right now. The first 2 have actually been on our list for multiple years. The first one started as a proposed constitutional tweak to fix a technical committee supermajority issue in the Constitution. Given the events of the last year, that has not surprisingly now sort of exploded into, I think, 6-ish? About 6 subtopics, all relating to the membership of the committee, what the terms of, the duration of terms of service on the technical committee should be, how the tech committee chairman should be chosen, how, there's a bunch of logistics things about the committee. There's a suggestion that changing the Constitution to go from 8 to 9 members, having an odd number might reduce the frequency with which the casting vote, which has now been used once, might ever have to be used again. All of those are good things. All of them are the sorts of things we want to get right and not rush into. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more conversation before we wrap that up, but there has been a lot of progress on that. The list of decisions on the web page being incomplete, someday somebody will sit down and actually backfill that, maybe. There's an open question about menu systems. This has to do with the Debian menu versus the freedesktop.org menu specification files, and why we have sort of 2 different ways for specifying GUI application menu entries. There's a draft proposal that Keith put together that we've had, I guess, a couple of rounds of conversation about in our monthly IRC meetings. There's certainly some more work to do before we're ready to take that to a vote, though, I think. And then relatively recently, the question of the maintainership of the aptitude package has been brought to us, and there's been some conversation about that. I don't know that I at least feel like we're very close to any sort of specific decision on that. I guess before we just open up to questions from the floor, is there anything that any of you would like to add in the way of comments about either the things that got resolved in the last year or the things that are open right now, or should we just open up and see what people want to talk about?
Let's just open up.
Okay, so with that, we're open to questions. This mic is loose. I don't know if we have another one in the room or not, but if you would like to ask a question or have something you'd like to say, procedural, technical, whatever, raise a hand or something, and we'll be happy to take questions and converse about things as long as we have time.
Questions?
Oh, come on.
I'll go ahead and I'll vamp for a little bit while, we've got a question there in the back, and I'll talk as I deliver the microphone. So one thing I'm interested to know.
The threat of vamping was enough.
Yeah. One thing I'm interested to know from this group, just as an informal poll, as Bdale mentioned, we did discover that there's an unintended consequence of the fact that so many people are now delegated into their roles in Debian, which is now we've found, and the secretary has actually ruled on this as a constitutional interpretation, saying that we, in fact, don't have the authority as the technical committee to overrule delegates in their decisions, which means nobody does as far as I can tell, other than like doing a straight GR every time. So I'm interested to know, maybe we can get some discussion about that here, but I'll pass the mic first to see whether people think that's something we should fix.
How elaborate do you prefer the questions forwarded to the technical committee? Because I have in mind the question of libav and ffmpeg, and would you like to have a bug report with just these 2 words or some reasoning, or how? Because I think this question is imminent that it has to be decided, but
Here. There's no reason for me to come up, just pull it off.
Sure. I think it really helps when the tech committee doesn't have to go do a bunch of investigation that other people already know. One of the reasons libjpeg took so long was that we had to go, well, partly because we were all distracted with certain other extremely long threads, and partly because we had to go chase up a bunch of potential argument for one side or another that had not really been fully presented in the thread. And it's much easier if we actually have the arguments right there in front of us, and then we're not left trying to effectively work out what one side of the argument or the other might be on our own.
So I mean, if there's something that's causing a problem and it needs to be escalated, it would be better to escalate it sooner when it needs to be than to spend a lot of time trying to write up some kind of summary and have it agreed by everybody. This is particularly true if the thing is, if it's very political and very controversial. For a simple technical thing, I'd certainly encourage people to try and write up the dispute in some, neutral, friendly, constructive way. But some issues that is more difficult, in which case we're going to need everybody to put their own side, and in that case, just filing a bug against the TC is probably the right approach.
That being said, a little bit of expectation management here. The question that's being posed on Debian Devel right now is, can we have, well, there's 2 questions. Can we have ffmpeg back in for Jessie, and can we switch between libav and ffmpeg for Jessie? And the Jessie freeze is coming up. Prospects of the technical committee being able to resolve this in the absence of the wider developer community being able to resolve it on their own in the time required to make a decision for Jessie seems dicey.
Also, aren't both the security team and the release team delegated?
You can offer advice.
They've only said they don't want both of them in. We could pick a different default without overriding either team.
And in practice, while we may not have the constitutional authority to overrule them, our relationship with the delegated teams is in fact very good. And if we suggested to a delegated team that we would like a particular outcome, I think that wouldn't really be too big a problem, unless we were completely mad, and hopefully we're not.
Yeah, I was mostly kidding on that.
Hi. So is it fine for me to just sit here? Or? Okay. So Sam Hartman, I guess I'd like to really thank you for doing an excellent job over last year. There's been a lot of mail on the technical committee mailing list. And one of the things I really appreciate is that there actually been a couple of times when, I see red when I read mail from that I happen to have a different opinion on. Interestingly, not having to do with init systems. But the thing is that I really appreciate that even then, the mail is written from a heartfelt desire to constructively make the project better. And I am really happy at all of the things in a number of threads, especially the init system thread, but throughout everything, where it's clear that you guys are trying to work together while actually understanding that there are some options that are unacceptable to some members of the TC. And that's okay. Thanks for doing a great job.
Thank you.
So there's been this trend of trying to organize more sprints, so people do get to meet face to face. I was wondering if, for example, for an issue that took as long as the init system, could flying all the TC together in one place would have shortened the resolution period?
I think it probably would have done, but it would have other effects that we might not want. The problem we'd run into, I think, would be that the transparency of that kind of thing would be problematic. We would have to video the entire meeting or something. Right.
Right. I mean, that could be done. It would end up looking more like a UN Security Council session or something. You know, we'd all be stood round a table, and there'd be a microphone each. And when we broke for lunch, we wouldn't be allowed to talk about anything. You know, we just have to talk about the weather.
Says we're already not allowed to.
Right. But if we wanted to, like, you know, make that a transparent process, we would have to go to those kind of lengths, and that I'm not sure how much fun that would be.
Also, some of us travel better than others. I'm not sure I really want to be flying around the country.
Well, I was going to say, too, that the fact that there's 6 of us here in one place at one time is actually fairly unusual. And it's not that it hasn't happened before, but opportunities other than Debconf to get us all sufficiently motivated to put the rest of our lives aside to go somewhere at the same time together are really difficult to orchestrate. And I think it'd be very hard to do on short notice. And so the idea that, you know, something's escalating to the point where that would be a good process to invoke, and that you could actually get all of us to get together in one place quickly, you know, it sounds like a great idea, and I'm sure most of us would actually, you know, be happy to try it, particularly if there were, you know, good food involved. But, you know, at the end of the day, as frustrating as it can be sometimes to watch the process, and believe me, it's just as frustrating to be involved in the process sometimes. I have to tell you that the fact that sort of every one of us thinks about the issue, about each other and so forth, ends up being, you know, documented in an email thread that Don says now helps stress test the VTS. These are the sorts of things this generates, you know, it's a documentation record for everybody that comes afterwards, understanding how we got to where we were and why we made the decisions we did. And that degree of openness is really, really hard to even contemplate wanting to move away from.
The other thing that I would add to that is that I at least think differently when I'm writing things up in email than when I'm discussing them in person. So I find it much easier to reach a shared decision in person in ways that are possibly not good, because it's a lot easier to fall into sort of a groupthink consensus when you're all in the same room. Whereas when I'm trying to write up detailed arguments on a thread, it makes me think harder, and sometimes I end up convincing myself of something different in the process of writing the argument.
Yeah, and to some degree, the arguments we have to present, there's kind of an essay aspect to the work we do to do that, which you don't have in the course of like a stand-up sort of face-to-face spoken meeting, and that's useful in part for the transparency, in part because it challenges us to articulate our arguments better.
Other questions? Oh, come on. Y'all are
Let's-
Have you got any pet peeves?
Let-
must have a pet peeve. Somebody.
Let's use the rest of the time to work through the constitutional issues. We can just use the rest of the BOF to sit here and on display. We can talk through the constitutional issues.
So I'd like to have some informal poll of my own. How many people would think that not having the tech committee would be an improvement? Yeah. I think No, in general, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so how would you like to do that? Show of hands, good?
What's the alternative? GR as decision of last resort?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so show of hands. How many people would prefer a Debian project in which there were no technical committee and decisions of last resort went to a GR?
The others might not be in the room.
That's completely fair.
have the other set of
Right, and
We'll turn our backs.
yeah, I was going to say, we didn't hand out rotten fruit in advance, so I'm not sure how best to do this, but
If you do a show of hands, you have to do both sides.
yes, right. Show of hands, how many folks think the current constitutional structure with a technical committee to make decisions of last resort is a good system? Okay, well, certainly of the folks in the room, that seems...
Recusing ourselves.
I was going to say, this seems like a good...
one with a real conflict of interest because I set it up.
So I guess maybe it's interesting to explore that a little bit. Do you feel that the technical committee, do you feel that way because you think the technical committee has made poor decisions, that there's a lack of legitimacy to the decisions that it makes, or is it just because you like GRs?
So I definitely don't like GRs. But I also fear that the technical committee is, as a self-selected group of people, is not working. I mean, as well as it could be, and it seems like I fear that it's become more tempted to override people for something where it's their area of responsibility. They are the choice that they've made. You might disagree with the choice, but I mean, I think even if you disagree with the choice that somebody's made, and when it's their area of responsibility, the threshold for saying, I disagree with you, from saying that to I overrule your decision should be higher.
Julian.
That's a perfectly valid point of view. Bdale, can you put the list of decisions from this last year back up? So
We'd actually do better 1 year previously.
right. So this does not include us having overruled anybody. The previous year we overruled Gilgam on multi-arch, and
You could argue about whether libjpeg, we didn't actually formally use the overriding power, but it was kind of skidding the edge of it.
well, I mean that was like two camps. There's the libjpeg turbo camp and the libjpeg 8 camp, and there's a difference between us saying, well, we're going to overturn the status quo when really it's not really obvious that the libjpeg 8 camp, just by having got there first, I mean, maybe you disagree, but it doesn't feel like overruling to me. But the Gilliam's multi-arch thing was probably the biggest decision we took in the previous year.
No.
And
Network manager. I think that
the network manager was the most contentious decision that we took, and we did overrule there. Now you can, maybe that's what the kind of thing you're thinking of. The decision with the biggest impact on the project was the multi-arch decision, and having looked at what's happened since, I now think we were probably right to do that. It's not completely clear, but I'm not unhappy that that's what we did.
I also wanted to add, I mentioned when we were talking about the open bug about the supermajority fix and so forth, that's now popped into about a half dozen subtopics. And a couple of them are specifically about the composition of the committee, whether there should be something like a term limit on participation in the committee. I think the current best idea for managing the chairmanship of the committee was the notion that the committee ought to elect its chairman every time there was a change in the membership or composition of the committee. There are a number of things like that that are currently that we're currently discussing that might sort of affect the other side of this, which is, you know, how do you know that the committee remains sort of vital, responsible, connected to the project, and all of those sorts of things. And this is why I say I don't think we're really quite ready to, you know, vote in the large on exactly what the constitutional change should be, because I don't know that we've really gotten to the end of the thought process about how that should work. Inputs today or at other times about, you know, your thinking about how that should work, particularly if you're willing to go look at some of the discussion we've had, particularly in our IRC meeting logs about this topic, and, you know, let us know what you think of some of the proposals that are floating around. The sort of how people get on the committee, you know, whether it should be a more elected kind of thing or whether the current process of selection remains the right one with some tweaks around sort of term limiting kind of things or not, I suspect is another topic that we could have some really interesting conversation about. But I would suggest that you think about both sides of that. One side is sort of the how do decisions get made and how does overruling happen and so forth, and the other is the sort of how do you actually decide whether you're able to trust that the people making up the committee, you know, are sort of doing the honorable thing at all times. And those are, I think, both reasonable topics for us to have lots of conversation about.
And regarding the actual matter of overruling of maintainers, I know this is a common sentiment. Nobody likes to be overruled. Nobody likes to see their peers overruled. But there's two points that I think we should look at there. One is, as has been pointed out, the actual frequency with which overruling, a true overrule, happens. And the other is the aspect that even having the question come up is very psychically draining for a maintainer or a developer to even have to go through that process. And yes, when that happens, it's not good.
Well, we don't
however,
tend to inject ourselves, right? Because
right, the technical committee does not, as a body, initiate that process. Those things, the questions of overruling a maintainer only arise because some developer is concerned that the wrong decision has been made.
It's probably also worth pointing out that the only times this ever comes up are essentially when things have already gone badly wrong. You know, somebody is very dissatisfied enough to crank the process up to 11 and bring it to the tech committee. That's maybe been a little more frequent now than it has been in previous years, but it's generally not obvious that doing nothing would be an improvement. There's always some project-wide or at least very large contention involved before it gets anywhere near us. So we essentially only deal with things that are already in a bad state. There are a few questions.
Yeah, just one more quick thing I wanted to say on that topic, though. It's that the other problem with that whole with all of that is that while overriding and even discussing an override is hugely psychically draining and hard for the people involved, the other side of that is that not having a decision is also psychically draining. And so one of the things that hopefully the technical committee helps with, and I think that our track record has been mixed in part because it takes us so long to make decisions for other good reasons, is that if you reach some sense of closure, sometimes that's better even if you lose.
Right. I mean, what you don't see, interestingly, on that is we get quite a few incoming issues of one kind or another where the submitter is aggrieved somehow, and usually just like one member of the technical committee writes back and says, really, we don't think we're going to overrule a maintainer on this. This is just this. You know, you haven't explained what the problem is, or this isn't serious enough, or whatever the situation is, and essentially that really, you know, that helps the maintainer to not have to deal with that issue anymore, because essentially the complainant's avenues have been closed off. But there's another thing I wanted to say, which is, you know, we don't like being overruled, Debian, of course, in theory, we put the needs of our users first. And what that means is that as a maintainer, our responsibility is to our users, and if a maintainer is failing in that responsibility, it's the responsibility of the project as a whole to set them straight. And obviously that's not necessarily a pleasant experience for the maintainer, but most of us are users too, right? So we've been on the other side of a bug report where the maintainer seems not to be listening. And behind each one of us who's articulate enough to have to try and have that conversation with the maintainer and who understands the process well enough to deal with that, there's probably a bunch of users who are upset and don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yes.
So I'm Manoj, and I have one comment and a question. The comment is that being overruled by a GR is probably worse than being overruled by the technical committee. There are far more relationships damaged if you are overruled by a GR. So the question that I have for the TC is, in the past, one of the reasons people didn't bring things before the TC was the lag time before a decision could be reached. I understand that while I have been missing, things have improved because the TC never used to have that many decisions in a year.
Very true.
Is this something that you guys are considering streamlining, or are there ways that we could reach consensus faster? I mean, flying people together was one of the ways that people are proposing getting there, but if that's not the answer, what else is?
So actually, as I mentioned earlier, Zach's suggestion I guess it was actually in Banja Luka that we had that. I think it was then that we had the conversation. It took a little while to get started, but this business of having a monthly IRC meeting has been, I think, really helpful because it causes all of us to have sort of a pseudo deadline once a month to go remind ourselves what our action items were and decide whether we have time to do something in the last hour before the meeting.
If you
Yes.
graphed my activity, it would.
But honestly, I think just reminding ourselves on a regular cadence of what issues are open and where they are and who said they'd do what, who hasn't gotten to it yet, and should somebody else try to pick that up has been really helpful.
So concretely, things have improved. If you come to the TC now with a decision that's not enormously politically charged and where most of the TC members agree one way or the other, you'll probably have a decision in a month or two or maybe 3. Now, that sounds like a very long time, but given how long it takes to make any other kind of decision in Debian, particularly a decision to change anything, that's kind of lightning fast by Debian standards. So
It's been faster.
and we have sometimes been faster. We've managed 1 week.
So, sorry, a number of things accumulated. One, I guess I don't, seconding what Manoj said, don't discount the possibility that the reason you're seeing more overrides is that you're actually effective these days. And that basically it's not that people are being more litigious, it's that issues that people would have just taken the hit to say, I'll never get this fixed, I have no recourse, they're realizing they have recourse. And I think that's a good for the project. Number 2, I don't know how I feel personally, but Bdale asked the question of, I guess Steve asked the question of, should the TC be able to override delegates? I'm still pondering this, but here's a devil's advocate argument for why not, which is that the important thing, or an important thing from a governance standpoint, is to have a check and balance on individual decisions to help keep them in alignment with the project. For individual maintainers, there isn't really a check and balance besides the TC and peer pressure. GRs are an option of even last resort, but they're really heavyweight. But for delegates, there are a couple of check and balances. First of all, we tend to delegate teams rather than individuals. Second of all, while you can't be undelegated, while the DPL can't revoke it, can't do something because of a decision, your track record can be considered in whether a delegation is removed. And so there are other checks and balances. It would also be good from a governance standpoint not to have a body having too much power. One thing that it would be interesting to look at is do a retrospective on some of your issues that you raised and how effective it's been. I will call two to mind. One is Network Manager. I'll note that there was a lot of effort and heartache spent on Network Manager, and yet the way it ended up, pretty much you get Network Manager if you install GNOME, and it really is kind of hard not to get it. And it's still the case that you can get into situations where your networking doesn't work if you install a system and Network Manager thinks it's supposed to be managing it, and yet there's Etsy interfaces involved. I've actually seen, particularly on live DVD installs, getting into some kind of impressive Network Manager fights with the rest of the system issues. So, was it actually worth the pain there? And I don't know what the answer is, but it might be worth going back and thinking about that. And then again on systemd, it's really hard to install a system without a Jessie system without systemd as PID 1 if you install any significant set of software. And I don't think that was quite what was envisioned during the discussions.
It was exactly what
No, okay. Excuse me. I'm sorry, Ian. I do not believe that was what the people voting for systemd quite envisioned at the end of that TC discussion. Yeah, right.
Did you file a bug?
No.
Okay. But anyway, and one final note is you talk about how painful it is to override a maintainer. There are skills in terms of empathic communication and working with people to actually communicate with them in less painful ways that it actually would probably be worth the TC spending time learning. Because we actually, as a project, could work to make disagreements less painful, and you as leaders could help lead the way.
Interesting thought, Sam. Thanks.
Yeah.
It is on. I don't know if it's turned. Is that working? Okay, cool.
One comment on the systemd thing and what's happened subsequently. Well, it was something that we discussed as a possible thing that could happen during the discussion. I at least was completely surprised by the speed at which Canonical essentially moved away from Upstart, and that significantly changes what it looks like going forward in the archive for multiple init systems, because that was like the other big one, right? So I think that some of the reason why now it looks like systemd all the time was because Canonical made this decision almost immediately after the decision. And Steve probably has more insight into that, but that was, at least to me, that was a significant surprise.
The reason it looks like systemd all the time is because of some of these questions of how good does the compatibility have to be for things like login-D to allow it as an alternative have led to the desktop systems which do require a dbus interface which is provided by systemd, and they're pulling in systemd by default. We're at the point today where I think even now testing, I think if you install GNOME, it pulls in systemd as PID 1. And there's a little bit of work that we may have to do to clean that up yet. I don't know exactly where that stands. I think systemd in the archive in testing has the necessary ORD dependency, but that the version of systemd shim that has made it into testing isn't at a level that provides that compatibility. So that's actually that's my fail for not following through on that, and I'm working with the FTP team to fix that.
Can I stand up and have a show of hands? Can I do this?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. My name's Martin. I just wanted to follow up on something that Russ said earlier. I'm going to quote you, not verbatim, but he said that sometimes closure is worthwhile to work for, and you don't necessarily need consensus for everything. I would like to put you in the situation that we are in. We are a group of people that are volunteers and working on a common goal. We also have a technical committee that we have all voted early on to be the sort of like neutral, objective body to make final decisions in case we can't come up with them. I would really like to see a show of hands in this very representative crowd of the Debian project between what you would really prefer if you had to choose one of the two. Option one being endless discussions.
Further discussion.
Until you have consensus, which we have been known to reach. So this is not a garden path dead end. It's just going to take a long time. And option two, realizing at some point in time that this is going to take a long time, so deferring it to a committee, who then makes a decision that not everybody likes, but brings us closure. All right? There's only two options.
You ratify the proposal.
Further discussion is part of the proposal A. Yeah? So can I see a show of hands for those people who would prefer option A, which is long discussions until you have consensus?
What I'm doing is voting for both options.
This is a bad question because the reason that you have the technical committee is that you hope that these people are sensible enough to strike a balance between those two options.
Sure. That's included.
So there is no question. They're there to decide what is the right balance between those two extremes.
Actually, if we modify the proposal one for Martin,
are we taking the amendments?
Instead of going for an absolute consensus, if we decide to go for a rough consensus instead, where you don't need to have absolutely the last project member agreeing, that might be more reasonable than discussion until everybody is convinced.
As the newest member of the technical committee, I was a little unaware of the long history of the process of the technical committee. And I was, the init system debate, well, I think contentious within the committee. What's the one for? So we only have 1 minute left? Okay. Faster.
Last word, man.
Okay. While it was very contentious, I think what it raised within the technical committee was the notion that the technical committee itself does not have to come to consensus to resolve an issue, and that our existing voting process was sufficient in order to come to closure. It didn't make everybody happy, but I think if the technical committee would take a more principled view on using, constructing a vote and taking a vote and calling the issue at an end when issues are clearly not going to be resolved quickly, that we could make progress more quickly. Oftentimes we do spend a lot of time in the technical committee trying to generate total consensus among the technical committee. And for some issues, that makes a lot of sense. But I think we need to be more aggressive in taking votes instead and getting to majority or rough consensus, as Manoj says, instead of trying to get to a total consensus of the committee. And using our existing process to resolve issues more quickly by coming to rough consensus or even just majority seems like a process that we should be using more often rather than less often.
Okay, well, I think with that, we really are just about out of time. Ian, do you want to?
I have one thing that I wanted to say in response to Sam, which is Sam mentioned the network manager, and we mentioned systemd, and I think that a thing that has really disappointed me over the last couple of years in the attitudes of some of my colleagues is their position towards the defense of minorities in Debian, by which I don't mean, blacks and gays. I mean people who choose a decision that is unpopular. And recently we've seen a lot of those communities losing out. And I'm hoping that this won't carry on.
Okay, well, with that, I think we really are out of time. Thank you very much for being here. I know that most of us are going to be around for at least part of the week. We certainly would encourage you to come find us, have more conversation, ask questions. This discussion, the technical committee processes, et cetera, don't stop at the end of this meeting. They keep going. So feel free to stay engaged and help us in any way that you would like to. Thank you very much for your time and attention.